Assalamu alaikum. Hello, good afternoon. Are you there?
Welcome, salam.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, doctor.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, doctor.
Okay, I just left. It's about time, but there are just 65 of you available right now. So 50 more students are not here. Can you please tell them to join as soon as possible? Right. I think we can start now. The rest can join up, can catch up with us later. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes.
All right. So I think today we are going to discuss about literature search and literature review. This is actually part of your research process. If you remember in our first lecture, when we talked about research process, we talked about literature review as one of the components of research. So here are the learning outcomes of this lecture. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe or define what scientific literature is and the types or classes of scientific literature, describe literature review, types of reviews, and understand the purpose or the reason why you actually conduct literature review and how to conduct your own literature review. So to start off with, we need to define literature. What do you mean? What do you understand when you hear the word literature? Today I'm going to engage you. So what comes to your mind when you hear the word literature?
Writings.
Okay, writing, okay. Beside writing, any other thing?
Research study.
Can you speak louder?
Research study.
Research?
Study. Research
Okay,
study.
research study, okay. Accepted. Another opinion or idea? Any other idea?
Academic research.
The academic research, okay. All right, so when we talk about literature, scientific literature, to be more specific, we are referring to a body of materials or ideas on a particular subject that has been either published or yet to be published. So it can be an article, a full-length article, it can be a systematic review, a narrative review, or anything. So long as it is an existing body of information, then it is a scientific literature. Scientific literature literatures can be classified into three types. The first group is primary, you have secondary and tertiary. So for primary, they are usually the original sources of information. These include original articles that are either published or even unpublished work that are source of certain ideas. So usually all the other sources of information tap their information from the primary sources. The secondary sources are usually electronic databases that act as an intermediary between the primary and the tertiary sources. They usually electronic databases that index some of the published primary literatures. Some of these example of some of these secondary sources of literature includes Google Scholar, you have Scopus, you have PubMed, you have Medline, you have once again you have Cochrane Library. All of these electronic databases comprise what is your secondary sources of information. They are actually built based on what the primary sources that you have. So you access them to be able to reach what the primary sources. On their own, they are not independent. They are actually dependent on the information available on from the primary sources. For the tertiary sources, this is actually like a summary or overview of existing primary literatures. I said primary literature, not secondary, because secondary is like just an electronic database, like a platform for you to explore and get access to the primary sources. So in tertiary sources, you are summarizing existing information into what? A kind of like comprehensive way of presenting the idea of a particular topic. Example of this is what we call clinical practice guidelines. There are several of them, and I believe even Malaysia has several kinds of them. You have this clinical practice guidelines for treatment of diabetes, anemia, hypertension, heart failure. All of these conditions have their own clinical practice guidelines. And these guidelines is actually a comprehensive review of available information. So you can actually use them. The good thing about them is that they are more easy to use. Why? Because all of the information has been compressed in that single source of information. You don't have to go out to look for the individual sources. Although in certain situations, you may need to read further the primary sources, and the primary sources are usually cited in these tertiary sources. So you can actually consult them and read more. Besides CPGs, you have review articles. All types of reviews are classified as tertiary source of information, be it literature review, a narrative review, a scoping review, or a systematic review. Whatever kind of review you have is actually a tertiary source of information. Textbooks are also tertiary sources because usually you have different chapters in a textbook, and those chapters are actually coming up with different ideas, and they tap their information from the primary sources. Is this clear?
Yes, Dr. Clear.
So if you have any question, you can stop me, please. I'll stop and then entertain questions before I go further. Any question at this point?
So far, no.
All right.
No.
So now let's talk about literature review. Literature review, like I said at the beginning of the lecture, is actually a process where you search for existing materials or existing literature that have been published on a particular topic that you use in planning your own research. For example, if you want to conduct research about the treatment outcomes of malaria or of dengue fever in Malaysia, one of the things you need to do is to look at the existing literature and say, what has been done before, right? You want to know what has been done and what has not been done. The reason for this is because you don't want to duplicate what is existing in the literature. You want to also understand what is it that has not been done so that you can confidently say what your own study will add to existing literature. And it is also important to note that you cannot conduct a research without a literature review. There must be a literature review. You have to look at what has been done previously and where are the gaps. What will your own research address? These are all important things that you have to consider when you do your own literature review. So the purpose of conducting a literature review, I listed about 6 of them here, but you can easily compress these into 3. The first one, I said earlier, is to identify what other people have done before and what are the gaps and the things that need. In addition, you don't want to duplicate what is available in the literature. So you want something that is new that will address a particular issue in that problem. So this is one portion. The second portion is that you use literature review to build your own methodology. What kind of study design do you want to use? These will be informed based on what is available in the literature. What kind of tool or questionnaire do you want to use will be informed by what? Literature. What are the variables that you need to measure? How do you measure them? How do you analyze? How do you interpret? Information is going to come from what? The review of your literature. The third aspect, which is also important, is when you discuss your results at the end of that is in your own discussion. When you are discussing your results, you have to compare your own result with what is existing in literature. So this is why literature review is important. So all what I have put in this slide can be summarized into 3. Important in building your what? Your own research objective, and identifying your research purpose. Secondly, for the methodology, and thirdly, for the discussion purpose. Is this clear?
Clear.
Okay, do you have any question? If you have any question, please pause me and I'll stop and take questions. And if you don't want to talk, you can put the question in the comment section. Then at the end of the lecture, inshallah, I'll take all the questions and address them. For the attendance, you don't need to worry. I'm going to use the Microsoft Team attendance for this purpose. So at the end of the day, I will key into ITA Alim later on. Or have you been able to submit your attendance in ITA Alim? Have you tried submitting your attendance on iTalim?
There's no button to click on.
Okay, so I think don't worry, I'll use the attendance from this session and then at the end of the day I'll transfer to iTalim. Right. So now let's move to the types of reviews. I've mentioned them already, so there's no point asking you. But let me test your memory. What are the types of reviews I mentioned earlier? Or what are the types of reviews you are familiar with? What are the types of reviews that you're familiar with? I know because you've had lectures on literature search 2 days ago, right?
Systemic review.
Systematic review, okay, 1.
Narrative review.
Okay, 2. Any other one? These two are already very good, but there are more. Any other opinion or idea? If you do your research, what kind of reviews do you do in your research? If you're writing your research, what kind of review do you do? What's the title of the chapter 2 of your research reports? Chapter 1 is introduction, right? Chapter 2 is what?
Literature review.
Okay, very good. 3, we have 3 now. We've mentioned systematic review, narrative review, literature review, okay? Any other one? Have you heard of the term scoping review?
No.
Scoping
No,
review is closely related to systematic review because the procedure is actually rigorous as systematic review, but the difference is just in the nature of summarizing the evidence. There's a way you grade the evidence so that you see if the studies that were available that you use to make your conclusion are actually powerful enough to reach that conclusion, to support that conclusion. It may, in other words, the level of bias in those studies will inform your final decision. Are the studies having high level of bias? So high level of bias implies low quality. Low level of bias implies high quality. So in systematic review, you look at this, you critically appraise the studies to make your own conclusion. So you'll be appraising the findings of those studies to make your final conclusion. But in scoping review, this component is actually missing. Okay, so I think let's talk about the types of reviews. The first one, we have literature review. Literature review, and secondly, we have narrative review. These two types of reviews are similar to each other because they both look at a broad research question. They are not specific. For example, now, if you want to conduct a literature review, suppose you are conducting a research on maybe say treatment outcomes of diabetes in Malaysia. Treatment outcome of diabetes is actually a broad topic. Treatment outcome among which population? Are you talking about adults, children, or elderly? Are you talking about patient with type 1 diabetes? Are you talking about patient with type 2 diabetes? Are you talking about patient with diabetes and other comorbidities, or patient with diabetes and no comorbidity? So this is actually a very broad subject area. And in these kind of reviews, both literature and narrative reviews, the researcher has the power to pick whatever study he wants, as well as remove the ones that he doesn't want in their own review. In other words, the level of bias in both literature and narrative review, because there is no systematic process governing the selection of studies and exclusion of studies from their review. So the decision whether to include or to exclude the study from the review is at the discretion of the reviewer. Okay, so for scoping review, I said earlier, is similar to systematic review. Usually the focus is actually specific. They have a specific objective. Although sometimes they may have broad objective, but in this kind of studies, you are summarizing the size of the available evidence and what they have concluded. You do not critically appraise the quality of the evidence. There is no critical appraisal looking at the influence of other forms of bias on what? The conclusion of the study. But in a systematic review, you have a specific objective, usually 1 or 2 or 3, very narrowed down objectives. And the search for the study, the identification of the articles you want to include, the selection, critical appraisal, how you collect the data, how you analyze, who will collect the data, who will analyze, if there's any form of disagreement, how do you sort out those agreements? All of these are done in a very systematic process that has to be predetermined before you start the review. Predetermined means that you already know this is what you want to do before you start doing it. If your objective is okay from the beginning, if you're conducting a systematic review, you need to know, okay, what are the search words you want to use? What are the eligibility criteria? What kind of studies do you want to include? And what are the types of studies you do not want to include? You have to state this clearly before you begin. It's unlike other reviews where you can only continue and then you go at your own discretion. But in systematic review, you have to state all of these procedures. Why do you want to include this study, these categories of studies? You need to explain all of those things before you begin. Who will collect the data? Do you need 2 people to collect the data? Okay, yes, more than 2 people, fine. How will they collect the data? If there's any disagreement between the people collecting the data, how do you resolve those disagreements? All of those things have to be clearly mentioned or clearly known before you can begin a systematic review. And that is why the quality of evidence or the level of evidence from a systematic review is higher than other types of reviews, because it is a critically appraised summary of existing literature. Is this clear? Am I talking too fast? Yes, student, are you with me?
Yes, Doctor. It's clear, Doctor.
Do you have any question? If it's not clear, if I'm talking too fast, please you stop me, okay? Because it will make no sense for me to just talk, and you don't understand what I'm saying. Do you get the difference between a systematic review and a scoping review?
Doctor,
Yes.
can you repeat the scope review?
Yeah, for scoping review, what happens in scoping review is that you summarize existing literature, but you do not critically appraise. Critically appraising is like subjecting the research findings to a validity and a reliability testing to see if the findings actually are reliable and have low level of bias. That is what you do in systematic review, and that is what is missing in a scoping review. In scoping review, the procedure is similar to a systematic review. The only place where the difference comes is that in systematic review, you are making your conclusion based on what the quality of the evidence you have. Is it low quality of the evidence? Is it medium quality, moderate quality, or high quality? But in scoping review, you only look at existing literature and you summarize what they have mentioned. Is that clear?
Yes, it's clear, Doctor. Thank you.
All right. Any other question? Okay, let me proceed. So how do you conduct a literature review? For the purpose of this course, we are looking at literature. I want to do systematic review or scoping review. I think that is under the research project 1. So for this course, what we expect you to do in your own report or in your research is okay. We are not asking you to do a systematic or a narrative review or a scoping review for your research projects. A literature review is fine. That is, the decision whether to include any study, in your report, in your literature review is at your own discretion. But it is advisable to make sure that you include important studies in your literature review, because literature review, you don't have to capture all of the existing literature. Unlike in systematic review and narrative review and scoping review, where you're expected to look at virtually all available information and use search terms and search databases that will capture almost all of the available data that's available. Okay, so for your course, for this purpose of this course, please just focus on conducting a literature review. And so to conduct a literature review, you need to have about 5 or 6 things at the back of your mind. The first one, you need to define your research question. What is the topic that you are studying? Suppose maybe you want to look at maybe say knowledge, attitude, and perception towards COVID-19. So that is actually your research question. What do people know about COVID-19? What is their attitude towards COVID-19? What is their perception towards COVID-19? So that defines your research question. So the next thing is that what is the scope of your review? The scope of your review, who are you looking at? Are you looking at the knowledge, attitude, and perception among Malaysians in South Asia or across the world? Are you looking at it among patients with diabetes? Are you looking at it among the population, the public? Are you looking at it among children? Okay, so it depends on the scope. What do you want to achieve at the end of your review? The third thing, you need to know what databases do you want to use to conduct your research. Usually, we use electronic databases these days. Textbooks and other things, the era is actually fading away. And now we are in the era of using electronic databases. For electronic databases, it is difficult to find one database that will index all available information. So usually it is advisable to use more than one database. Okay, so fourthly, you conduct the search. Conducting the search here, you need to look at what are the keywords. If you have more than one keyword, how do you combine them? What are the synonyms of the keywords you have? How do you combine the synonyms of the keywords that you intend to use for your review? Fifth, you review the literature. That is, the studies that you intend to include, you have to read them. And then how do you summarize the evidence and write your own review? That is your literature review. So I'm going to take this one after the other. For the first one, your research question. Your research question can be broad or specific or narrow. Specific or narrow is the same, okay? But it's important not to make it too broad and too narrow. This is for the purpose of what? Literature review. For systematic review, it is important to have it as a narrow objective. What are the specific things you want to look at? And usually they don't want you to, it's not advisable to look at broad range of objectives. 1, 2, or 3 maximum is fine with systematic review. But in literature review, you are looking at a broad concept. For now, if you said knowledge about COVID-19, knowledge of what? Is it the knowledge of the cause of the virus? Is it the knowledge of the source of the way the virus is transmitted? Is it the knowledge of the symptoms? Is it the knowledge of the treatment? Is it the knowledge of the prevention strategies? These are all issues that are encapsulated in under one theme, which is knowledge. So the objective or the question that you intend to address is not very specific in this case. If you want to look at the attitude of people towards COVID-19 or their perception towards COVID-19, you can look at different things. Their attitude towards the mitigation strategy is something. Their perception towards it, if they believe those strategies can prevent it, or if they do not believe. If they do not believe, why? So those are some of the things you can look at if you are looking at your research questions. So depending on your topic, you have to look at a broad range of issues. Usually, because I think for most of you, you may not have a very narrow research objective. So usually you have different components. That's why it cannot be narrow. It has to be broad in some way. Okay, but it is important that you make it as not too broad in a way, please. If you're conducting a literature review, just make it consistent or align it with the objective of your research. If you have just 3 objectives, just settle there, okay? Do not go out of your way just to make your literature review look big or make it lengthy by adding even studies that are not relevant to what the objective of your research. So the second thing you need to do, you need to decide on the scope. How many studies do you want to include for your literature review? How comprehensive do you want the literature review to be? From what year do you want to include? Is it from the study? Are you trying to include literatures that were published from the last 5 years, from the last 10 years? You have to decide this while doing your literature review. If you want to blend between the old ones and the new ones, it's still fine. Okay, what language do you need to search? Language for you here is not a barrier, because most of the articles are published in English. Suppose maybe say you are from an Arab country and you want to conduct a research about something that is specific for that country, and then you are aware that there are journals that publish in Arabic as well as English, then you can broaden the search to include both languages. So for you here, if there are Malay literatures, which I think are very, very rare on certain topics, then you can actually look at them. But it's in the context of teaching and learning, you may need to interpret those findings, or you may need to translate those findings into English. Is this okay? Do you have any question on defining your objectives and the scope? Any question? Okay. The third aspect is you select the databases. Which database do you want to search? Okay, so now we are actually using electronic databases. And examples of this electronic database include Google Scholar, you have PubMed, you have Scopus, you have Web of Science, you have Science Direct, Cochrane, you have ProQuest, EBSCOhost, a lot of them that you could use. But usually it is recommended that you use more than one electronic database because it is difficult for you to have just one database that will actually index all of the existing materials. So if there's anyone that I would suggest you use, not alone though, it should be either Google Scholar, PubMed. PubMed is a very large database. Google Scholar is also very good. You can use Web of Science, and Web of Science is more of articles that are published, that are indexed in ISI. Science Direct is more of Science Direct, Elsevier, and Cochrane is more of articles that are actually conducted by the Cochrane review team. So the ones that you can actually use that cover a broad range of topics will include Google Scholar, PubMed, or Scopus. And mind you, please try to use more than one database so that you can capture some of those studies that are not indexed in the first database in the second one. Okay, so now conducting your search and finding the literature. To conduct the search, first you need to create your keywords. So for now, the first example I made is knowledge, attitude, perception of COVID-19 among, say, maybe the general public. So your keywords are going to be what? Knowledge is one of them. Attitude is one of them. Perception is one of them. COVID-19 is one of the keywords. And you need to search if these keywords have synonyms. Those synonyms is to broaden the search, because not everyone will use COVID-19. Some people may put it as coronavirus 2019. Coronavirus 2019 is the same as COVID-19, but the way it is put, because whatever you feed into the system is what the system will provide for you. If you use COVID-19 alone, then it will only give you literatures that were indexed with the keyword of COVID-19. If you try to combine both COVID-19 and those ones that use coronavirus 2019, then you capture both. If you want to broaden, you can use the SARS, the severe acute respiratory virus 2, which is the virus that caused COVID-19. All of these ways are ways of broadening your search. So if, for example, now you want to look beside, another example is, suppose you want to look at, you want to conduct a review, a literature review on aspirin-induced GI bleeding. Your keywords are going to include aspirin as a name, but aspirin is also called acetyl salicylic acid, right? So you may need to combine these two keywords, the synonym of this word, the two words together in your search. Bleeding can also be called hemorrhage, right? There are other terms that you could use. Okay, so you need to include all of these in your words, in your keywords. But how do you now combine these words and their synonyms, as well as how do you combine the multiple words and their synonyms into one search to make one search? This is where the role of the Boolean operators or the Boolean indicators come in. Boolean indicators such as and, or not, and not are commonly used to improve the quality of your search. For example, if you want to combine synonymous words, like I said now, aspirin and acetyl salicylic acid, you can use the word or. So in that case, any article that was indexed using the word aspirin or acetyl salicylic acid will be available for you to review. If you use aspirin alone, those that were indexed using acetyl salicylic acid will not be available for you because the search result will not bring out that for you. If you use acetyl salicylic acid alone, those ones that were indexed using the term aspirin will not be in your search results. So this is why for the synonymous words, you combine them using what? Or. For the other words that are part of the search, that are part of the keywords that you want to use, you can combine them using and. For example, now we said aspirin and then want to talk about bleeding. So you can use aspirin or acetyl salicylic acid and bleeding or hemorrhage. So this is how you build your own search term that will encapsulate all of the keywords that you want to use to search for on the database. The last one you can use is also not. Not is for you to eliminate unnecessary records. But I think most common is not so commonly used, but depending on your situation and what study you want to do, you may need to use it if it applies, in order to screen and reduce the volume of literatures of material that will be available at your disposal, thereby reducing the time that you will, saving you time to conduct your review. Beside the Boolean indicators, you can also use truncation, wildcards. These include the use of things like asterisks, which you can use at the end of the keywords. Asterisks will find other words that are related to that keyword that you are searching for. You can also use question mark either at the end of the word or in the middle of the word in order to expand your search. But if you want to narrow down to a specific thing, you can put in inverted commas. If you put in inverted commas, the search will be limited to only those things in the inverted commas. Anything outside that will not be captured in the result of the search. Is this clear?
Clear, Doctor.
Clear,
Do
Doctor.
you have any question?
So far, I understand.
Okay, anyone has any question? If you cannot ask the question verbally, put the question in the chat box, then I'll address it along the line or at the end of the lecture. So far, I think there is no question in the chat box. Or please, if you have any, you can put in the chat box for the benefit of others. Or you can contact me later, but usually I prefer you ask in the class so that others too can benefit from the question you ask. All right. So while conducting your research, it is important for you to keep records of the references as well as the search, the keywords or the search terms you use on the databases. The reason for this is because sometimes you may need to update your review, particularly if you're conducting your research. If you do your literature review in the month of October 2020, Before you write your research report in December or January 2021, there will be additional studies that have been published. So you may want to update. So how do you then capture those ones? You can actually, there's a way you can do that. You can do that, I think on PubMed, there's a way you get updates. You search for updates. Any article that is published using those keywords that you use for you will get a notification of those articles. But for your level now, you can just take notes of the keywords that you use for the search and the Boolean indicators that you use to combine them. So you keep record of them. Any article that you are trying to you wish to include in your research or in your literature review, try to keep the reference so that you don't end up writing something important that you want to include in your literature review and you realize later that you did not reference it. If you do not reference it, then that means you cannot use it, because if you are using it, that is plagiarism, even if you paraphrase, because the original idea is not yours, it is from somebody's material. Okay, so if you're writing, always remember reference, the keywords you use, you try to note them down. The other thing again is the search strategies. If you are conducting a systematic review, usually you want to capture all relevant materials. Sometimes you can start from the most recent one using the retrospective method. You can start from the most recent material and then you go backward in time to see how the trend of the information available on that topic. You can also use targeted. For example, you narrow to a specific topic or you narrow to a specific author, particularly if you have someone who is a guru in that area of specialization or someone who is well known to be an authority in that area. You can also conduct your search using some of this approach or a mixture of all of these methods is applicable. But for your own search, I will still mention again, we're not asking you to capture all relevant material and then screen. No, just focus on the important ones that are important in your study. Is that clear?
Yes, doctor.
Okay, I mentioned this, managing your reference. But I think you had a practical session on Monday morning. Is it Monday or Tuesday morning? On literature search and Mendeley. Is that so? Am I right? Am I right? It's like you had a session with the librarian on Tuesday afternoon for literature search and how to use Mendeley. How many of you joined that session?
Yes, doctor.
Yes, but only the ones who take LS subject.
All right, because I discussed with the librarian this morning regarding the practical session for tomorrow. I want her to assist to teach you how to use either Mendeley or EndNotes. And she actually mentioned that she cannot complete that in 1 hour. I have discussed with the person in charge in your class, and she has requested for 2 hours. I'll also join the session with you so that she will teach you practically hands-on on how to use how to search on the electronic databases and how to manage your references. So inshallah, tomorrow, just get ready. We'll have a session and then try to be available with your own laptop, preferably, please. I'll prefer you use a laptop, not your handphone, because you need to practice what she is going to tell you. Because I think definitely she has a module on how to go about it tomorrow. So, and earlier we discussed with her, the session is going to start from 2:30 to 4:30 tomorrow. So please bear with us. We have to adjust the timetable from 1 hour to 2 hours.
Okay, doctor.
Okay. So the other part, the fifth item, is review of the literature. You have searched, you have used your keywords, you have used it on the databases, and then you have what? The results. You have the studies that you wish to include, because yours is a literature review, right? So you have the power to select which ones you want to include and which ones you do not want to include. So for those ones that you wish to include, how do they review them? You need to read them one after the other, right? So how do you read them? And while reading them, what do you need to have at the back of your mind? Even though it's a literature review, you should have at the back of your mind the quality of the study, because there are some that are so poor that including them in your own literature review will show the quality will reflect in the quality of your own review. Even though it's a literature review, if you have quality studies, even though you are selecting them on your own without any criteria, it shows that you've done a very good review. But if you end up including studies that were poorly conducted and have high level of bias or very obvious bias, it will actually reflect in the quality of your own review. So it is important you read through the study, and while reading through, the first thing you have to take cognizance of is the objective of those researchers. What was the objective? What were they trying to study? What was the method they used? Is the method valid? How was the data collected? How was it analyzed? Or are there any other source of maybe bias, such as including the conflict of interest? Was there any person funding them? And do you think the person funding those research will have an impact on the outcome that was reported? Are there any conflicting studies that have opposite results, as in they have results that are not consistent? One is supporting and the other is against. So you have to have all of this at the back of your mind. And as you read through, you need to make your jottings. I think I'll talk about that shortly. So another way that you can review is by grouping the articles into categories. For example, now if you are talking about the knowledge, attitude, and perception of COVID-19 or of dengue virus or anything, or hypertension, diabetes, or anything, you can group them based on what? The themes. Knowledge, articles that talk about knowledge will go together. Articles that talk about perception will go together. Articles that talk about attitude will also go together. So you can actually design it in this way and then read them each and make your own summary. Another way is by taking notes. Taking notes, usually there are more than two approaches, but for the purpose of this lecture, I've listed just two. One of which is the use of two columns. Two columns means you have the author's column and your own column. The author's column is a summary of what you think the author has done, summarizing in their own words, but there is no, it's just like you are describing the same thing using different words. And then your own column is where you write down your own assessments, any kind of criticism that you have about the study, about the findings, and about the conclusion. The sentence method is where you write down important ideas about the studies and then you number them. This is for you to then come up later on to discuss to write your own review. Because if you're writing your review, it's going to be, okay, what this person found, what other studies support this. There should be a link in what you are describing, not just different parts, different components being put together into one review just for the purpose of writing a review. No, your review should have a flow, should have a pattern, how you want it to flow, how do you want to organize it, what do you want to come first, and then what do you want to come next in the next paragraph. So it's important for you while reading to make this note and know the theme that you are actually captured. For example, if you have sentence method, you have up to 5-6 sentences from that article. What are the themes of each of these points that you have actually jotted down? So at the end of the day, if you're writing, then you'll be able to link the theme of article 1 and article 2, 3 or 4 together. The theme 2 will go together, and then if there is any inconsistencies, you can discuss and then bring in your own voice. Okay. And then lastly is writing the review. To write the review, there are two approaches. Some people do summarize the findings of those studies that they include in their literature in a tabular form. Tabular form where you describe the study, the name of the authors and the year in which it was published, the objective of the researchers, the findings, and then the country in which it was conducted, if necessary. But I think usually if you can write down the name of the authors and the year it was published, the objective and the study design and the findings or the important result of the study or conclusion of the study is fine. But some people combine both the tabular method as well as expressing them in words. In other words, it means that you write a brief summary of what each study has concluded, and then later on put them in a tabular form. Both are acceptable. But for me, I think I will suggest you use both, because some people are not comfortable with using the tabular form. But if your project supervisors are comfortable with the literature review in a tabular form, then you go with that. Because I will not be the one to assess you at the end of your project. Your project supervisors are the ones that will assess you. So whatever you do should be to the satisfaction of your project supervisors. The other thing is how you plan and organize your review. What do you intend to include? How do you plan to structure it? Because usually your review should be structured in a way that you start with an introduction, and then you come with the body of the literature. What are the things that we have found from the literature, and where are the gaps? And then what is the conclusion? Then the conclusion usually comes with the gaps. What are the things that you think need to be explored, or things that have been done before but you think they can be done in a different way, or things that have not been done before and you think need to be addressed? So all of this should be captured in writing your own review at the end of the day. And it is also important, if you're writing other types of review, to describe the methodology that you use. For literature review, you do not need to describe the methodology. For narrative review, you need to. For systematic review and scoping review, you actually have to describe the methodology if you are reporting them. But for literature review in a research, you do not need to describe the search terms, the keywords that you use, the database that you use to get the articles. You just need to describe start with an introduction of your literature review. Why are you reviewing the literature, or the purpose of your review? And then what do studies that you have included in your review stated or found? And then at the end of the day, you come with your conclusion. What are the gaps and what are the things that you need? What is your own voice? Is this clear?
Yes, okay.
Or am I talking too fast? If I'm talking too fast, tell me. I'm not going to penalize anyone for telling me I'm talking too fast. I know naturally I talk very fast, and when I talk these days, I try to slow down. But if that is not enough, you tell me, please. Any question or any issues with the flow of the lecture? Any issue? Question? Do you have any question?
No, Doctor.
Okay, that means everything is understood. Is that so?
I have a question.
Okay.
If there is qualitative data that we want to assess, can we do that in tabular form?
Yes, you can also do that in tabular form. You can put it in tabular form, because under the column of results and conclusion, that's where you put what was found. The objective, you just describe what was the objective, and then you can put in bracket the study design. Is it a qualitative or a quantitative study? If it's quantitative, what kind of quantitative? Is it cross-sectional? Is it retrospective? Is it prospective? I hope that answers your question, brother.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Any other question?
Doctor, I have a question, but in the chat box.
Okay. Well, for your question, it depends on what your research objective is. Are you looking at depression among teenagers or depression among the general population. If you are looking at depression among teenagers, then it's more specific. Although if you cannot find sufficient literature regarding depression in teenagers, you may have to make do with depression in the general population. So that at the end of the day, you compare what they have found with what has been described in other studies. Okay, so you can actually look at it from the perspective. Your literature review can come looking at depression in teenagers in Malaysia alone. You can look at depression in teenagers across the world if you have evidence. If there is no sufficient literature on that, then at the end of the day, you have to describe depression in maybe the general population, depression among different category of the population. So maybe patient with diabetes, patient with cancer. If there is depression among this category, then you can actually include these in your review. Because sometimes it's difficult to find articles that discuss your own topic alone, particularly if you're dealing with a new topic that has not been explored before. All right, sister?
All right, Doctor, thank you.
Okay. Another question? Okay, to assess for bias, that will come under your lecture on critical appraisal. Okay, you'll be accessing studies for different level of bias, whether bias in the stage at the stage of data collection, bias in inclusions criteria. What was the population that was included? Was there any bias in the selection of the population? Was there any bias in the way the outcome was assessed? Was there any bias in the way the results were analyzed? Was there any bias in the way it was interpreted? Was there any bias in the conclusion of the authors? So some of these things will come, all of these things will come when you discuss about critical appraisal in subsequent lectures. I think that will come up, is it before or after mid-semester? And that will be taken up by Dr. Naim. All right, sister? Are we together? Hello?
Yes, Doctor.
Okay, are we together? Any other question?
In the chat box.
Okay. Okay, the decision on which one is relevant is actually based on your own discretion. You need to decide on which one is relevant. Suppose, for example, the example I've cited earlier, I made mention that if you're assessing the knowledge, attitude, and perception among the public on what COVID-19. So if you're assessing knowledge, attitude, and perception among the public, study if there is sufficient literature for you to discuss or for you to review in your literature review on the general public, say maybe studies that were done in other parts of the world, then it's okay. But by the time you start including studies that evaluated knowledge, attitude, and perception among healthcare workers, then you begin to know you are beginning to derail from your own, because you are not looking at healthcare workers. In your study, you are looking at the public. The public, you need to compare, you need to look at what other people have done among the public in other parts of the world, okay? So by the time you start looking at other components, then you are beginning to lose or move away from what you are actually trying to do. But in situations where you cannot or you do not find sufficient literature for your literature review, then you can start adding other things that are not directly related to what you want to do. just to have an idea of what have been done and how you can structure your own literature review and your own methodology. Mama Lukman, I hope this answers your question. Any other question? So do we need to take a break before the tutorial? Do you need a break?
Yes, doctor, maybe like a short break.
Okay, how many minutes?
5 minutes, okay.
All right, so let me grant you 10 minutes. Okay. So we're going to have a brief tutorial of the 3 topics we have discussed so far this week. That is introduction to the research cycle, regulations of research and research ethics, and this literature search. So I'll see you by 3:12, inshallah. Is that all right with you?
Sure, doctor, all right.
All right, so I'll see you then. All right, Assalamu alaikum. Again. Are you back?
Yes, yes. I'm
Okay,
back.
can we start now? But the tutorial is going to be interactive. I want to know what are the challenges you have, and then you discuss with me. If there's anything that I need to do, please you let me know. Okay? So in the first lecture, we talked about research, right? And we talked about the importance of why we conduct research. Can anyone tell me why we conduct research? Do I need to mention names? Nabil?
To expand knowledge.
Okay, besides expanding knowledge? Another person has an idea?
To prove a theory.
To prove a theory, okay, good. Another one?
Solve the problem.
To solve problems, okay, existing or new problems, good.
To test the validity of instruments, procedures, or experiments.
Okay, so if you have, suppose, for example, you design a questionnaire to measure adherence among patients. The question is just to ask them if they are adherent, and then you have a range of questions. We cannot comfortably say that this questionnaire will measure adherence in our patients. So we may need to validate and do a reliability testing. So after doing this, the validation of that process itself is a form of research. So you conduct research to validate and test that instrument to see if it will measure what you want it to measure. Because adherence is something that you are not there when the patient takes the medication. You only ask questions and the patient answers. So based on those answers, you want to state if the patient is adherent to medication or not. So such instrument or the questionnaire you have developed will need to undergo validity testing. And I think for most of you that will use questionnaires, if you are doing surveys, you may need to do validity testing as well as test for the reliability, do pilot study if need be. I think for most of you, you may need to do that, except if maybe due to the COVID situation, you cannot. But I think most supervisors will want you to do the pilot testing, okay? So in that testing, you're actually testing the reliability as well as the validity of the items on the questionnaire to see if they will measure what you want them to measure. So that's another thing that has to do with research. So now we have mentioned 4 things, right? Advanced knowledge, to prove a theory, to solve problem, and then to validate instruments, okay? Then the next thing we talked about is inductive and deductive research procedure. Can anyone here just remind me what is the difference between inductive and deductive approach? Anyone? Can you tell me, please?
Inductive is the start from observed pattern, while deductive to confirm theories.
Okay, so it's actually the opposite of each other, right? For inductive, you are starting with observation before you come to what? The pattern. You see the pattern and then you come up with a hypothesis and then what? The theory. But in deductive, you already have a theory, but you want to confirm that theory through what? Observation. Okay, so in inductive, you're actually trying to use your observation to make your own theory, to produce your theory. In other words, you use inductive approach to make theories, and then you use deductive approach to confirm what? Theories. You can also put it that way. Okay? Is this okay? Or do you have any question regarding what we have discussed or what we have talked about now? Any question? Because this is like a tutorial, so you need to make your comment. If there's anything I said that you don't understand, ask questions. I'll prefer you ask your questions because for me, I believe I've done my best. If there's anything that is not clear, I have to re-explain to all of you. It's my duty to do that. But if you keep quiet, I will not know what is it that you need to know and what is it that you already know. So I'll assume you all understand. Nadra, do you have anything to say? You are raising up your hand.
Doctor,
Yes.
the literature review, we need to do research proposal, right? For the assignment.
Yes.
So it depends on the lecture itself to decide whether it is literature review or we have to do literature review.
No, in your project, it's going to be a literature review. If you want to do a systematic review or a scoping review, that will be under literature search as a course. That's research project 1. Is it project 1 or research project 2? Literature search. But for the purpose of your report, it's actually a literature review. Even in PhD master's thesis, they don't ask you to do a systematic review. It's just a literature review, but they want the literature review to be rich.
Okay.
Okay, they said there's a question by Sister Nalili, okay? I have a question. What kind of review needs to conduct a questionnaire? Is it irrelevant to include a questionnaire in literature review? Well, if your research objective is looking at the validity of certain questionnaires and measuring some outcomes, then fine, you can talk about them there. But if the research is not talking about, if questionnaire is not one of the themes of your research, then there's absolutely no need to talk about it in your literature review, because literature review is basically looking at what has been done, what was the objective of previous studies, what were their findings. So what are the other things that has not been explored? And those are the things that you need to highlight, and then you need to state these are the things that your own study need to address. So, but if your research focus is looking at the validity and the reliability of a questionnaire measuring, say, maybe adherence among diabetic patients, we have several questionnaires. Then you can discuss those questionnaires in your literature review. Is that clear? Nailili Izati, Iza. Does that answer your question? All right, thank you. So now we have talked about inductive and deductive. Now, can we now look at the research process? What are the components of a research process? What are the components of a research process? I think I mentioned about 8 components.
Yes, problems.
Okay, can you list them?
We have to know the problems.
Okay, very important, good.
And then we do some literature review.
Okay, very good.
And then we have the objective and hypothesis.
All right. Also, can you now see the link? From the literature review, you highlight the gaps. Yes. And those gaps will form what you build your own objectives based on those gaps. What are those things that have not been explored? Okay, so now you are seeing the link. Okay, after your objective, then what?
We make the hypothesis.
Okay, hypothesis, research question, hypothesis, and objective are together.
Okay.
So what's the next thing?
We design the research, our research.
Designing the research, you have to fall back to the literature review again to see what kind of approach or what kind of study design was used in previous studies. Okay, And then if you don't want your study to be consistent with that, then you have to give reasons. You need to justify. Although you can disagree, if you feel, okay, your own research should look at a different study design, you can do that, but you need to justify why yours is different from the previous ones. Okay, so after the study design, what is the next thing? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Research for the population.
Okay, the population and the sampling. So, but for research population and sampling, you need to think about also what the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Who do you want to include and why? Usually, this is one thing with research. Why? Who do you want to exclude? Why do you want to include those set of people from your research? So you should always, if you are presenting, these are some of the things that people will ask you. Why did you include this? How did you arrive at your sample size? Sample size, Dr. Elena Im is going to teach you how to determine sample size. Okay, how do you determine sample size? How did you get your total sample? What sampling method did you use? Is it convenient? Is it systematic? And why? So usually you should always prepare for the why question. People will ask you, how did you do this? Why did you do this? So at the back of your mind, at each stage of your research, you should always remember this, because the question can come out from any side, any angle. Why did you do this? Or why did you exclude this? Why did you use this approach? Why not this approach? So you should be ready with answers, particularly when you are presenting your proposal and your research findings. And if you're writing your report and you want it to look excellent, then you can justify even in your report, in your research reports and the proposal. Are we together?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so after the study population and the sampling method, what is the next thing?
We do the data collection.
Okay, for data collection, what are the things you need to consider in data collection?
Is the method that we use is valid? So, for example, like this situation you have now, I'm not sure if this is correct or not, but we are doing better with the online data collection rather than face to face.
Excellent. So you have actually addressed the whole issue. You use online surveys due to the COVID-19 situation. The moment you mention this, no one is going to ask you any question regarding that. You've already given the reason why you didn't use face-to-face. Because of you want to adhere to the COVID-19 SOP. So at that stage, I like the way you actually explain it. What do you need to use? Are you using a questionnaire? Do you want to interview people over the telephone? Do you want to observe people? These are some of the things that entails or encapsulates your data collection process. Are you doing a qualitative study or a quantitative study? In qualitative, okay, what are the things, the tools you need to collect your data? Who do you need to interview? How do you need to interview them? Is it by telephone? Is it by face-to-face? If you are using a questionnaire, are you developing a questionnaire from starting afresh, or are you adopting a questionnaire that has been used previously, or do you want to adapt? Adapting means you use but you modify a little bit. Adopt, it means you are using it the way it is in the previous study. So some of these things are the things that you need to look out at the stage of data collection. How do you want to collect the data? Do you want to look at things, events, going forward, or you want to look at events going backward? For example, now you can conduct a research to ask people about how they coped with the MCO during the MCO between March and June. So this way, you're actually looking at previous historical data. People need to remember what they did and how they cope with the situation at that time. But now, if you're now looking at how will students cope with online learning during the current situation, you're looking at it prospectively because it's an ongoing process. But if you want to look at it backwardly, going backward in time, you can also do that. So this is what we will, I'm just giving you an overview of what will come later on when we just talk about research design and study methods. So we will teach you this, and then you will now apply in your own research and justify why you are using that approach in your own research. Is this okay?
Okay, Doctor.
Am I talking too fast?
A little bit, but I think it's okay.
Okay, inshallah, then I'll take notes. So the point of what I said is this, that for the study design, you can look at it prospectively or retrospectively, okay? Prospective look means you are looking forward in time. For example, if I want to conduct a study among pharmacy students to assess how they are coping with the online learning during this period, this first semester, it's actually prospective. I'm looking at it, what is going on now, right? So, but if I want to look at it retrospectively, I can also do the same study. How did pharmacy students cope with online learning, the ERTL, during the second semester of the last session? This means I'm going backward in time. I'm still assessing virtually almost the same thing, but the direction of approach is different. This is going prospectively, looking at it as it is going on, and this is going backward in time. What has happened before? Or do you want to look at it as cross-sectional? What is happening now, not what will happen in the future again? So it depends on you, but this will all be informed from what your objective and what has been done in previous studies. Is that clear?
Yes, doctor.
Okay. So after the data collection, what do you need to do next? You have two more steps.
We analyze data.
Yes. So for data analysis, you have to think about what is the tests. What kind of test do you want to use to analyze the data? Which one is appropriate? So this will, you don't need to panic over this, because in the course of the lecture, before you start your data collection, I believe you'll be taught about data analysis. What are the kind of measurements you use? Are you using yes or no question? Are you using hierarchy, like strongly agree, disagree? Are you using numbers, direct numbers? All of these will now determine what kind of statistical tests or approach you use in your analysis. So as you do all this now, just for now, for this stage, we're just focusing on literature review. That's where we have stopped. Subsequently, we'll talk about the methods and then the measurements of your variables. If you're measuring your variables, do you use intervals, do you use numbers, do you use ratios, or do you use hierarchy? Or do you use hierarchy? So based on the type of the measurement you use, you will choose an appropriate statistical test for your own data, okay? And then after data analysis, you would also need to interpret the data. What does it mean? Okay, and then later on, you compare your own results. Okay, what's the next stage? I'm beginning to talk too much. After data analysis, what is next?
Data interpretation.
Okay, interpretation. All right. After data interpretation,
We reach the conclusion or not yet?
yeah, but before conclusion, usually you have to discuss, right? You need to discuss your result. And while discussing your result, you have to make reference to your literature review. So you can see how important literature review is in your own research. It's important at the stage of methodology. It's also important in what? Results and your analysis. It's important in your discussion because you need to compare your own findings with the previous studies. And you also need the literature review to shape your own objective. So it's safe to say that the literature review is the core of your research. If you have a very good literature review and you understand your literature review very well, then I believe other components will gel. They will be very good. But if you have a very poor literature review, believe me, there will be loopholes in other components. It's either your discussion will not be sound, or your objective will not look very nice, or the methodology will have issues. So please pay attention to your literature review. Whoever is going to do the literature review for your group needs to update you on what he or she has found, okay? Any question? Ada soalan?
So far clear, Doctor.
Okay. So now yesterday we talked about research ethics and regulation, right? I talked about research malpractices.
Yes.
Or misconducts. What are the things? What are the three things we talked about?
The start.
Fraud.
The
Okay.
the
Okay. What do you understand by fraud? Research fraud.
We do
That's why I didn't send the lecture notes, because if you have the lecture notes, you just read from the lecture notes. So I'll send the lecture notes today. I wanted to have the tutorials before the lecture notes, just to keep your minds with me, okay? Can someone answer the question? Example of scientific misconduct. You said fraud. So what are the kind of things that are considered as fraudulent research?
Lie
about what? Agree
lie
with lie.
about the data.
Okay, deception.
We
Someone say deception. Okay, lying about the data. Okay, good. Beside data, is there anything that you can lie about? Manipulating the data. Very good. Okay. All right. Invent new data. That is, you use the data. That's you are using data that does not exist. You didn't collect the data and then you just formulate the data. Okay, good. Manipulating the data. Okay, so that you reach a conclusion. You have a result that you want. Okay, very good. Okay, beside the data, can you manipulate the data collection as well as the analysis? Exploit information without acknowledgement. Okay, that is under piracy or plagiarism. But I think you are actually on point. It's still part of misconduct. Okay, no, for the part that will comment and critique the author will be at the discussion part. You can also include this in the introduction in your literature review, as well as you are comparing your own findings with previous studies. If they are consistent, fine. If there's any inconsistency, that's where you need to explain. Why do you think your own findings are different from the other findings in the previous studies? So you should be ready for such things. If you think maybe the previous studies we are having some bias, then you can mention that. But you need to explain what kind of bias it is and why you think it will affect the outcome of the study. Is that it? Is that tool? I hope this answers your question. All right. Beside the research fraud, we talk about another thing again. We talked about two more things, two closely related issues. Can anyone remind me about them?
Piracy and plagiarism.
Yes, piracy and plagiarism. And what is the difference between piracy and plagiarism?
The scale. The piracy is in the large scale, but plagiarism, we take the idea without credit in just a portion of idea.
All right, very good, excellent. So how about research on ethical research? We mentioned about 3 or 4 on ethical research. Can you remember them? There's one that I expect you to remember.
Monster study.
Yeah, very good. Monster study. Why is it called a monster study? Because it's only a monster that will what? Conduct research and deceive orphans. Orphans are special people in the population. They are people we should actually look after, not exploit. So it is called a monster study because the study was conducted among orphans without any consent, using deception. Okay, so beside monsters, you've mentioned the Nazi human experimentation, which involves several experiments that were conducted among prisoners of war and then the Tuskegee syphilis experiment.